Hello, everybody. Happy Wednesday and welcome to Let's Talk with Dr. Cindy. I'm here today to talk with one of my guest bloggers, Dr. Toyin Falusi, and I am so excited, guys, and I think you're going to be just as excited as I am. Dr. Falusi is an amazing physician, infectious disease specialist, author, mom, new wife, and a blogger, specifically blogging about so many issues. But today she's here to talk about her guest blog on the Dr. Cindy Duke website, which is all about menopause. And I encourage you guys, if you haven't read the blog yet, to check it out. We'll be sharing the link during today's program. But really, what you'll get out of today's talk is you'll get to know more about Dr. Toyin, how you can follow her yourself. You'll hear about her blog and why she wrote the blog about menopause and the 7 habits to get through it. But you'd also hear other pearls from her as it relates to, for us Gen Xers, where more and more of us are entering menopause. I know, kind of hard to admit, right? But for Generation X, we're either in perimenopause or menopause at this point. And it's important for us to take ownership of that and talk about it. And Dr. Falusi is going to talk about every aspect of that, including sexual health, safe sexual health, and all the parts that pertain to that as well. And so with no further ado, let's welcome Dr. Toyin Falusi. Hello, Doc. Welcome.
Nice. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. And thank you so much for submitting your guest blog. And thank you so much for agreeing to join me today. So what has your experience been like since releasing the blog?
Oh my gosh, the feedback has been much more than I expected. So I did a podcast a few months ago, just kind of talking a little bit about menopause, but then I've following your work and the amazing work you do in the area of fertility and sexual health and education around COVID. And so that's how I found you on Instagram. I decided to follow you, went on your site, and I saw something you had put out for guest blogging. And I thought this is such an important topic because menopause is not something we like to talk about. I find that with women, when you finally are around somebody who says, oh my gosh, I'm having a hot flash, or oh my gosh, my libido is off, or whatever it is, then you feel comfortable. And then you're talking in hushed tones. And it really was kind of, like you said, embracing what is about to happen or what is going on, because that is a natural part of our growing older. I don't want to say the word aging, but that is a blessing, right? So sometimes it happens super early because of surgical menopause or, things that happen with people getting chemotherapy or radiation. But if it happens as a natural part of your aging process, it's going to happen. And instead of talking about it in hushed tones or feeling embarrassed about it or the stigma around it, or it was really embracing something that is happening, that happens to all of us if we're fortunate enough to live to a certain age, and taking ownership for it. And the feedback has been great. People have loved it. They've related to it. People have, some people have sent me little funny stories about, those hot flashes. And people have said, mine has gone on forever. The peri part is like, what is this? Peri. But just trying to bring some levity to something that is natural, something that is part of our aging process. And I think of it as the beginning of that next phase of life, right?
And it's important to frame it that way. And I'm so pleased that you framed it that way. I'm actually going to raise my seat here. I'm really pleased that you framed it that way because many people dread menopause as opposed to welcoming it as the next phase. And so you really eloquently framed it as a transition, but a welcome transition. And I think that's such an important conversation for us as Generation X to have, because I think for most of us who identify as Gen Xers, meaning those who were born pretty much the 70s and very early 80s, we like to think more of ourselves as still very young. Our parents, we are very much so. And, the thought of us having symptoms that our parents and grandparents had is shocking, and yet it's going to happen. And although our parents and grandparents' generation didn't talk about it, that doesn't mean we need to keep it secret. So without giving away the entire blog post, can you
Yes.
highlight for us some of the things that you talk about? Specifically, you talk about the 7 habits. What are the 7 habits, and why did you
Okay.
come up with that title?
Yes. So, I mean, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People is a book by Stephen Covey, which a lot of people have read in their work life, in their
Yeah,
business world. It's about really work and, personal relationships. But I love that book. I read it first, I think, probably 15 years ago. And I read it again about 10 years ago and then 5 years ago. And when I was writing my book on divorce, I channeled those 7 habits into how to be prepared for divorce process and co-parenting. And I did a blog on those 7 habits on preparing to be an empty nester. Some of us are empty nesters. The 7 habits, and you can apply that broadly. And they really fall into there are 7 habits that fall into 3 categories. The first 3 are personal victories. These are things you work on internally. The
yeah,
next 3 are public victories that interface with others. And the final is this stage of renewal or sharpening the saw. And those first 3 are really, be proactive.
yes,
Second one is begin with the end in mind. And the third one is put first things first, right? All those things are private things you're working on, right? Beginning with the end in mind, being proactive. The next 3 are public victories. This is how you interface with the outside world, right? Thinking win-win, seeking first to understand, then be understood, and then synergy. Synergy is like what we're doing now, talking about menopause and sharing that information. And then the 7th habit is renewal. And I think we can apply those 7 habits to pretty much anything. Our work life, our personal relationships, how we approach issues. But specifically about menopause, I thought, you know what? This is something that's going to happen. It happens every day to thousands and hundreds of thousands of women get into that. And so the blog was really channeling that and saying, you know what? Being proactive. So we know menopause is going to happen. I'm not going to take away, you do all this work with women. So, the average age is supposed to be about 52. I went earlier. My mom went earlier. So being proactive, knowing that it's going to happen, starting to research about it. Women, we do a fantastic job researching everything for our
yeah,
kids, tutors, the best schools, the best this, the best tutors, the best, but when it comes to ourselves, we're not necessarily that pro ourselves, like being proactive about it, thinking it's going to happen. What do I need to know about it? Am I going to consider hormonal therapy? Am I not going to? Doing your research and being prepared for that process. The second one, really thinking about, begin with the end in mind. It will end. It's going to be uncomfortable. It might be uncomfortable. Your libido may take a big hit. There's vaginal dryness. There's sometimes
yes,
mental health issues, serious depression, anxiety. Sometimes it's just night sweats. It's horrible drenching sweats. I would make rounds, and in the middle of rounds at 8:30 in the morning, we walk into an isolation room with my mask on, and I get out and I'm just drenching. And these guys on my team are like, what is wrong with her? It's Chicago. It's not even that, it's cold,
yes,
So, but it will end. And there will become a time where you can drink coffee and have a glass of red wine without breaking into a sweat. So beginning with that end in mind frames it, right? And then just again, putting first things first. And this is where the first things is you. Yes, many women go through menopause every single day, but this is about you, putting yourself first and really thinking about during that process, what do you need to make yourself comfortable? If you need extra, thread sheets, if you
yes,
need massages, if you need to start seeing a psychotherapist, whatever you need to embrace that part is putting yourself first and then thinking, while I'm doing this, putting myself first. What have I done with my mammogram? I'm up to date with my colon screening. Have I been checked for HIV? What am I doing about my sexual health? And so those are kind of those personal things that you're thinking about. And then the other part about, really thinking win-win is at the end of this, guess what? You don't have to worry about getting pregnant if you don't want to. You can, and we still have to talk about, safe sex and things like that. But just you don't have to invest in tampons or pads. There's just a lot of things. You don't have to travel and call the hotel concierge for So thinking about there are things that are going to happen that are going to be wins after that, and then just trying to understand what's going on. So I don't want to give away too much. I think it's an excellent book. But then the part around synergy, That's where, you know, it's one of those public things, talking to people who've gone through the same process, sharing, paying it forward. You know, what did you do when you were considering hormonal therapy? What
Yeah,
helped? What natural products helped? What things helped? Because some people talk about their memory, things like that. And then the renewal is channeling the things you learned during that process. You can apply it to other things. There's that next phase and thinking of, now I'm going to write my book. I'm going to publish. I'm going to do guest blogging on Dr. Cindy Duke's site. So if you think about it, because we don't give ourselves enough, credit for doing all this stuff and living to that age. And this age is usually tough for women, right? We're usually in our early 50s, kind of stride our career. We're usually in leadership or mid or management positions. We're supervising people. If we've been blessed with children, we're raising kids. Our parents are older. We're sandwiched in there. And then all of a sudden, there's all these things happening. Your hormones are going haywire, but you don't have the luxury of your teenager. When the teenagers are going through puberty, everybody expects them to be moody. They can slam their doors. They stay indoors. You have to go to work and be all these things. So it's okay. You know, you start growing hair in weird places. It's kind of like, what's going on?
Hey,
But,
I have to say, even though I'm in my 40s, early 40s, but the hair growing in places that you don't expect
like, what is this?
so real. Oh my gosh. You know, it's funny you bring that up because just 3 days ago, I was on the phone with my mom and she's like, what are you doing? And I was like, well, I'm actually in the bathroom squeezing out hairs. I was like, whoever.
I know. My sister showed me the best way to do that.
And, you know, but these are the things we need to talk about. We need to make light of, but we also need to make sure that our peers, our sisters out there hear this and know they're not weird. They're not suddenly transforming or losing their femininity.
I know. And
because
that's important because it forced me to have conversations with my daughters because initially it was the sweats. And then, you know, like all of a sudden I'm like turning the thing on, the fan is on, we're watching stuff together. I'm like getting up, I'm stripping. They're like, what is wrong with you? And then they notice like, Mom, every time you drink wine, you get all sweaty and I'm taking off my wig and I'm just all weird. And so it forced us to have that conversation. And we talked about it and they said, oh, and then one of my daughters said, isn't it supposed to be at 50? I said, you know what? My mom went a little earlier and it forced us to talk about family history, about age at puberty and age at menopause. So you know where your fertility lifespan is. Our kids are high achieving kids, a lot of young women, your career, but if your family history shows that you have a very short fertility window, we need to talk about these things. And while you're talking about that, you can't talk about menopause and sexual health without talking about safe sex practices, without talking about prevention, without talking about mammograms. So these are things that conversations I have with my daughters, my sisters, and we talk about this because if you're blessed enough to live to 50 and then get to menopause, it's that next phase of life.
That next phase. And I think, you know, it's important that for those who are listening, let's define menopause. So menopause is defined as absence of period, so no menses for 12 months back to back, right? We also look at a few other things like what are your FSH or follicle stimulating hormone levels to correlate that. But really, it's defined as the absence of periods for 12 consecutive months. And so it's so important that we talk about that because so many people say it's impossible. I cannot have menopause. I'm too young. But Dr. Toyin brings up a very important point, which for some families, there are genetic or inherited wiring or codes that lead to the women going into menopause at earlier ages. Some of them go into menopause before 40. We call that early premature menopause. So, and that's another thing that's important to define because when people hear the word early menopause, we're talking about people who've gone into menopause after age 40, but before the average age of 52. And then there's premature menopause, which happens before age 40. And that one tends to have genetic reasons. It may have autoimmune reasons, or people with really bad Hashimoto's, people with type 1 diabetes, these women may find that they go into menopause earlier, and that's in part because their underlying disease processes that negatively affect their egg count and lead to their eggs going away faster. But it's so important to talk with your family. I think for me, I can definitely say I've experienced some of these perimenopausal states and symptoms, and it's helpful. I mean, I call my mom and I'm like, "Hey, did you have this?" One day I
Yeah.
called her and I said, you really downplayed your transition to menopause. And
Yeah.
my mom was like, "What? Why do you sound angry at me?" And I said, "Well, it's just that I don't understand why you never talked about this stuff. Why you never acted like
So
this was a big deal."
our
And we need,
generation, I think we are in that position now to have these discussions with
yes,
the next generation. If we have daughters or nieces or just the people around us, because that family history is so important of going early. So I didn't have premature menopause, but I had earlier than 52.
mhm,
And when I talked to my mom about it, she said, yes, I went early too. She had 5 children, all that. But she said, I remember exactly when she passed out. She was giving a
mhm.
lecture. She's a university professor, but she got all hot and she passed out. And because she was still in her late 40s, they assumed, oh my God, maybe she's pregnant again. And, that was it. It was menopause. And I remember when I went to my doctor too, because I'd had, periods without months without, and they were like, oh, you're so young, you can't. But they said, well, just check your blood work. And my FSH, it was like, wow, I said, I told you, but get the blood work to prove it. And
Mhm.
and it
And
was that. But then
it's important that we talk
go
about
ahead.
that too, because I think sometimes, again, we always say, and I like to emphasize, women know their bodies best. Yet sometimes they
Yes.
go to their healthcare practitioner, whether it be a physician, and other allied health professional, and they get poo-pooed away, so to speak. It's dismissed, like you going in saying, "Listen, I'm pretty sure I'm experiencing menopausal symptoms," and them telling you you're too young,
Right.
without asking you about
Correct.
your family history and taking into account that there are genetics at play as
Correct.
well. That's a very
Correct.
big
And so
point.
that's why I said, if you want to prove it, get blood work, because I wanted to know what else I could try for hot flashes. And they tried this Bristol, something that was a mild
Mhm.
antidepressant that helped with flashes. I had to give up, as much coffee as I loved, because that you start to see things that help you and don't help you. Certain triggers. Red wine for me was like
A big
drenching
yes,
sweats. I had to I mean, I wouldn't be able to even wear my hair down. I had to have styles where, anything, the heat would just, and it's always unpredictable, but being able
correct.
to like make light of it and say, well, this is that. But also, I think the converse of that, when I talk about the blog about putting first things first, is when you know your body, you know when something is off. And it's
Mm,
we also don't want to assume that those symptoms are from menopause. We find out that
true.
women in that age group, women in their 50s, when I do HIV, that's what I've done for 25 years. There's a lot of new HIV infections that occur in women after the age of 50 for a
Yeah,
variety of reasons. They've been divorced and now they're back out. The game's changed. The streets are rough out there. They are widowed. They're in second marriages. They're out there dating, just exploring their sexuality, which is great. But the messaging around PrEP and prevention and HIV testing and rapid HIV testing kind of missed them because maybe they were in committed relationships for so long. And so we are seeing, especially among Black women, a higher rates of HIV infection after the age of 50. And because
yeah,
women feel like, well, I don't have to be on contraception anymore. I'm not going to get pregnant. But again, the risk of HIV, hepatitis C, hepatitis B, sexual transmitted infection. So that time is also a time to really, in terms of sexual health and screening, but also knowing that, night sweats, I'm infectious disease. I was thinking about tuberculosis. I used to joke on rounds when I walk out of an ISO room at the county hospital and your attending is drenched in sweat. I'd be like, guys, I don't have tuberculosis. Okay. I'm just a woman of a certain age and, a little IT humor, but there are other things that can mimic night sweats. There are other hormonal imbalances, thyroid stuff. There's just a lot of other things, right? So it's good to also get checked out to make sure, is this menopause? Is this menopause and something else? Or is this
yeah,
something else? And there are other
exactly.
things that could be going on, but you have to know yourself and
Mhm.
want to seek medical care for prevention, not until something goes wrong. to be able to know those things.
And I think that's so important because the symptoms of menopause can vary in different women.
Yes.
And so some women have symptoms that are so mild that all they do is report maybe that they felt a little warmer at some points of the
Yes.
day, but that's it. For others, it's, the recurrent hot flushes greater than 10 per day for some of them. For others, it's hot flush and trouble sleeping, trouble staying asleep, such that they're then
Yes.
fatigued and exhausted and
Yes.
think straight the following day, which means it
Yes.
can impact quality of work. I've certainly had
Yep.
patients come into me seeking assistance with their menopausal symptoms, not because necessarily
Correct.
things are bad at home, but because they're concerned for their job security, given the impact it's having on their job, on their memory. And I'll say, well, it's not that you're going into dementia, it's that you're not sleeping.
Yeah.
And so
Correct.
now the day you're forgetful, you're tired because you're not sleeping, secondary
Correct.
to your symptoms from your menopause.
Correct.
Speaking of sexual health,
And the
another
sleep
yes,
is, I just wanted to get just on that point of sleep, how important that is with all the
yes,
talks about, you're at that age, you're sandwiched between work and personal relationships, aging parents, children, all of that stuff. And then you can't sleep because you're waking up every hour for the
yes,
flashes. Then
right,
you have insomnia.
yeah,
And then it leads to weight gain because you can't sleep. So when you can't sleep, your cortisol levels are high, you gain weight. If you're up at 2 in the morning, what helps at 2 in the morning? Carbs and chocolate. I mean, no fruit ever seems to help, so you're eating odd times, everybody else is asleep, you can't sleep. It's just a lot of those things happen, and then it affects your weight, and then people already have maybe some insecurity and stigma around it. There's libido issues because your hormones are just changing. You're taking the sheets and stuff, your bedmate, your spouse, your partner, whoever is in your bed is just like, what, who's going to be in bed with me tonight,
And here's
so part of the blog is
there's one of our Twitter viewers, and Glenn, and he says, my wife is going through the change now. Nighttime cuddles are over because she overheats. And so this dovetails exactly with what you're talking about, which is it can impact intimacy. It can impact,
Yes.
sexual health. And indeed, because, cuddles are harder. She's frustrated. She's like, don't touch me. I just don't
It's
feel
like,
right.
I need air right now.
And that can really impact that intimacy. But the other thing is, as you alluded to, is vaginal dryness. And there's so many out there who are afraid to talk about it. We know, there's the controversial song that just came out, WAP, right? And yet,
yeah, my daughter's clued me in on that one.
Right? And so perimenopause, exactly. Perimenopause is exactly when someone may have a WAP problem. And so the question is, what do you do about that? And it's important that women know there are alternatives. There are lubricants available to try and use. And, they can range from, actually, we recommend household items now. We say start with things like coconut oil, etc. But it's important to know it's okay to have those conversations because intimacy is still very much important. For those who are in relationships, they get worried that their menopause may mean a signal, the end of their intimate life, a signal to their partner that it's time to step out, which is not true. And the truth is, women who are perimenopausal, menopausal, and postmenopausal can have very active and satisfying sexual lives. We just need to know about it.
Yes, they can. and you made an excellent. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Dr. Falusi.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to buttress off what you just said about the importance of communication is key. And I talk about that in the blog because, yes, you don't have to communicate to the whole world, but for the people that matter to you, who may see the effects, your kids who are in the house seeing the effect of a sleep-deprived, moody mother, or your partner or your bedmate or your spouse or husband who, your partner who is not able to understand what's going on and why intimacy is not. So that communication is key. And that's that part about, seek first to understand, then be understood, talking to people, and then thinking win-win, this will end. And when that person knows it's a transition phase, this may happen, communication is key. But when there's so much stigma around it, we don't want to talk about it, then it leads to disconnect, and the intimacy should now become even bigger than it is. And like you said, that's where that part of synergy, talking to your girlfriends. I had my bridal shower a couple of weeks ago, and I had a very small group of friends, my sisters and friends. And, when that certain age, some had been in menopause, and people were talking about, lubricants, and, you need to be able to talk about those part of your life. One of them was like, no love without jelly. I mean, I was like, oh, girl. I mean, but because her husband, you want to preserve that, knowing that the time, it's just a transition process and part of the age, but you need to be able to talk about it. You need to be able to communicate that and know that there are ways, but if you don't talk about it, don't share about it. And that's where that part of it is, talking to your healthcare provider, looking at natural things. And like you said, everyone's different. And, when we talk about seeking first to understand, not everyone's going to be empathetic to you. So for some women, if they've never had a problem and they just skip through menopause, was all roses and gardens, they may think you're being over the top, and that's okay. It is what it is. That's your story and that's your experience. And, as women, we need to support each other. So even if someone's bringing it up, the worst thing you can do is to discount someone's experience, right? And say, oh my gosh, what's the big deal about menopause? That's her transition.
It hurts her. It really hurts her. And, this happens to be World Menopause Awareness Month, right? And
I didn't know that.
It is. I was like, how perfect the timing of the blog and our live here. But it's Menopause Awareness Month. And indeed, I really want us to drive that home, which is menopause affects women from all walks of life, all ethnic backgrounds, in all countries, all cultural borders. It crosses those. And yes, it can be different. And it can be so different even within families. And so, one member of the family may sail through and another one is just not herself. And I like to describe it as, for some of us, our brains are very dependent on our hormone levels. Our brains are wired as women to respond to our estrogen levels. And for some of us, when our estrogen levels fall, it's catastrophic. And for some of us, we notice it even when they're on birth control or, temporary little changes, we see it. While others are like, oh, I had some symptoms, but it was okay. And others are like, oh, yeah, I guess I did go through menopause. My period stopped.
And that's it. Yeah. And everyone's story is different. Yeah.
Everyone's story is different, but it's important for everyone to feel like they have a safe space to have the conversation, to know that, okay, I may not be the one that needs something, but my friend over there, Toyin, is having some issues and she might need some supplements. She may need what we call naturopathic remedies, or she may need Brisdel, which is paroxetine, low doses of paroxetine, or she may actually need hormone.
That helps me a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, the paroxetine definitely helps. It's a serotonin receptor inhibitor, and it works by it's very low doses of essentially Paxil. But this is our branded one. It's 7.5 milligrams, and it really helps with what we call vasomotor symptoms or hot flash symptoms. For some women, they don't really suffer with the hot flashes, but they're suffering with vaginal dryness, issues with lubrication, issues with intimacy. And so we may have to work on something else, not necessarily Brisdel, but other things that can help with that specific symptom. For others, it's sleep. For others, they notice dramatic drops in their bone health or osteoporosis. Becomes, a big issue for them. And so what I'm talking about is really just to highlight between Dr. Toyin and I to you, the audience, that menopause happens. The bigger thing to let everybody know is Generation X is in menopause. Okay. I know that's shocking to hear, but
we're still acing.
Alert. We're acing it. We're taking care of our parents. We're taking care of children. We're taking care of our jobs. We're taking care of our partners, our careers, but we're also in menopause. And that means that we're feeling different symptoms that need to be addressed, need to be acknowledged, and really we need to help each other with. Now, Dr. Toyin, I'd be remiss if I let us end without talking about your book and your podcast. So tell us about your book. And it's perfectly, I think, aligns with the conversation we've just been having in the blog as well.
Okay. So, my primary job, I say, is, I'm an infectious disease physician, but I think my biggest accomplishments would be, raising these two amazing young women who are now 21 and 22 actually. And yes, amazing young women who are, compassionate, they're courageous, they're confident women. And I wrote my book, The Decade After, Thriving After Divorce. I wrote it 12 years after my divorce, when I got divorced when they were much younger. And it really was a decade after my divorce, based on four principles, really putting the children first so that they can have a shot at having a life that is not irreversibly altered by the divorce process. And that's a whole topic, putting the kids first. Second, on how to be an effective and successful co-parent. So tips on how to be a co-parent. That person is your ex, but as long as your children are alive, you are co-parents for the rest of their lives. You are their co-parents. So it's about co-parenting. It's about how you navigate the world and with other people. But then also a large part of that is your growth after the divorce, right? Growth to be better, not bitter after the divorce, to learn from that process, to engage yourself, to learn yourself better, to not rush into the next thing. And so I wrote it. It's called The Decade After, Thriving After Divorce. And it was really just my way of sharing tips or practical tips on staying positive and getting better, not bitter. And it's been, again, was more for me cathartic and sharing my story. And it's, again, done beyond what I expected. It's, it's available, paperback, audio, Kindle, and the feedback I've gotten all the time from women has just been phenomenal. And then more recently, I started to blog and did a podcast. It's called 10 Minutes with TM Fal. And 10 minutes, because I know we all have very busy lives, very short attention spans. And it's really just talking about serious issues, but with candor and humor. And so I talk about things that are infectious disease related, HIV, hepatitis, COVID, but I also talk about empty nesting and the reason why we need to learn ourselves, like do SWOT analysis on ourselves. I talk about setting boundaries in our lives as women. I talk about the importance of asking for help, not as a sign of weakness, but as a sign of strength. You're actually strong enough to know when you need help and who you need help for. I talk about, not comparing yourself to others. We all have different stories, how to support each other as women. Very short podcast, 10 minutes, and it's available on, on Apple and iTunes and all the other platforms for podcasts. But for me, thank you. My Infectious Disease Live is what I do as a physician on prevention and treatment. But I love empowering other women and really that next generation, taking away the stigma around divorce. It's about thriving after divorce. I'm not out there advocating for divorce. I'm not advocating for separations. But when it does happen, how do you have the best possible outcome after that for yourself? And if you have children, so that they're not statistics and data from divorce. And that's my emphasis, is about the children and having the best outcome after a divorce.
And also, I love that you're also highlighting that your life doesn't end as a woman with a divorce.
No.
Life goes on. And in fact, your life has gone on so beautifully that you actually went back out there and dated, met someone, and recently got married. Congratulations.
Yes. Thank you. 15 years after my divorce. And for me, I had a very clear plan that for a long time, and everyone's story is different, no comparisons, is that my primary job was to raise my daughters. They were very young when I got divorced. And between my full-time career and raising them, I really took myself out of the dating pool for a very long time because I just was not interested in partnering up. And I support people regardless of wherever they are in their stage. And some people want to partner up right away. You have to know yourself. And we talk about that in the book too. No comparisons, no judgment, because everyone has a different thing. It's not a herd mentality. It's not a group think effort. You need to know why you want to be in that next relationship. If you do want to get married or serious in a relationship, why that? Not because your ex did, not because everyone says you should, not because your parents are like, you can't be single, not for any reason except you want to. And then being out there and being safe during that process when you're dating. We talked about the need. PrEP is an amazing toolkit we have now in terms of prevention for HIV, screening, getting tested. Because if you're getting screened and getting tested for HIV and sexually transmitted infections, you're going to want that of any prospective sexual partner, because you've done that for yourself, right? Denial is not a good place to be in. So it's really important to know why, what you want, but also taking time after that divorce to figure out what part you played in the divorce, no matter, what happened. Learn from that process, learn yourself. And for me, paying attention to your children through the process and figuring out how to be an effective co-parenting through a divorce. And then when the time came and I figured in a mental space, you're ready, then that happened. And so, yeah, I'm newly married and I'm openly menopausal and having a great life, because it's just the beginning of that next phase, the beginning of a new phase in your life. And so it's really important to embrace change. And I talk about it even in my podcast, like change, even when it's planned, can be scary, but it's necessary.
Before we go, let's explain to people, let's break down the word PrEP so they understand what we mean by that. Because I know in our audience, particularly when this replays, and we have a very big replay audience, they need to understand what the word PrEP means. It's actually an acronym for certain words, and to ask their doctors for it. But also, we're also highlighting that even though you can't get pregnant because maybe you're now menopausal, it does not mean you cannot contract different sexually transmitted infections, and hence the role for condoms and other safe tools when you're out there, not to mention screening your partner, having that talk, because even PrEP is something you're using after exposure. So we need to talk a little bit about the pre-exposure as well.
Yes. So PrEP is pre-exposure prophylaxis. And then PEP is something that we also do sometimes with post-exposure prophylaxis. But you bring up an important point that even with menopause, you have to worry about with vaginal dryness. Actually, there's actually an increased risk of transmission because you have breaks in the epithelium, the natural protection, right? So that's why it's important to think about PrEP is just one of the main things in our toolkits, right? Barrier protection methods, condom use, but then pre-exposure prophylaxis. Right now, we have medications that are approved as a pill. People can take that effectively, taken daily, can reduce the risk of HIV acquisition by 90%, right? And there are going to be other medications approved hopefully by next year or shortly after, that will be injectables, just like, in the world of reproductive health, where women have options for pills, for patches, for shots, for implants, that there will be more options for prevention. So prevention is pre-exposure prophylaxis, but part of that engagement in that discussion around PrEP involves taking an HIV test, right? They do an HIV test. With that, they usually would offer hepatitis C testing, which is really high in the baby boomer generation. Hepatitis B, you can vaccinate against hepatitis B, testing for other things like gonorrhea, chlamydia. So it's really important to embrace sexual health and wholeness, right? Not absence of disease, but just like wholeness of your sexual health, optimizing that. And that way, having that discussion about options in your prevention toolkit. And those options are increasingly expanding.
True.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people haven't realized that the hepatitis, so to speak, so hepatitis C, hepatitis B, are sexually transmitted infections.
Yes.
Most people think sexually transmitted is HIV, gonorrhea, syphilis, chlamydia, and that's it. But no, hepatitis falls into sexually transmitted infections as well.
Yes. And, the recommendations for baby boomers to be tested, anybody born between 1945 and 1965, for hepatitis C testing. That's a lot of work I did on that in the last 10 years. And now we have cures for hepatitis C, that people can take meds for 8 weeks and be done, cured for hepatitis C. But to get to that point, you have to know you have the virus, right? So testing for that. And that's why it's important. And the kind of work that you do, also talking about educating the public, because sometimes, there's guideline recommendations and there's a discrepancy and uptake from primary care providers, either because they're too busy or they're not thinking about it. Some people think that people over 50 are not sexually active. So they're seeing a young doctor in their 20s and 30s. They're like, oh my gosh, she's 60. I'm not going to talk to her about sex. We've had new HIV cases diagnosed with people in their 70s, 75, diagnosed with HIV, and had been in different healthcare settings, never tested, because everyone's like, oh my God, I'm not going to ask grandpa about sex. People have sex.
They do. They
So,
accept that. And we
and
need
they
to
should.
they should. And we need to understand that for a lot of people in the Generation X baby boomer age group, sex historically was associated with pregnancy. And so they were actually maybe having less sex then because they were afraid of pregnancy. Now that pregnancy isn't a worry, they're actually having more of it, not less.
Yeah, we're seeing
That's why-
HIV in nursing homes everywhere. So yes, it's
and it's,
important to have. Yes.
because they're all
Yes.
thinking of the teenagers and the 20 somethings,
Yes.
right? And they're all like, yeah, if you're hearing about rising rates in HIV, hepatitis, gonorrhea, chlamydia, it's the young people. Oh, those young people. But actually, we're seeing it, like you said,
Yes.
in nursing homes. We're seeing it in 70-something-year-olds who might be going from doctor to doctor trying to figure out what's wrong with them.
Why? Correct.
Someone just didn't do an HIV test on them to figure out what's happening.
Correct. And sometimes we're having people diagnosed a lot later because all of their symptoms have been misdiagnosed. We talk about, people ask, why do people older with HIV have more advanced disease at presentations? Because they're not tested, because they don't think they're at risk, because they think it's the young people. Their physicians or people they're seeing don't think they're at risk because they're like, oh my God, that's my mom's age, I don't want to talk about it. And then the symptoms that they may have with early HIV can be very non-specific, a little bit of fatigue, tiredness, things like that. And so those are usually just chalked off as natural aging things, right? So it's important that knowing what are age-appropriate screenings and being, thinking of our sexual health as part of our overall physical health, right? We talk about physical health, mental health, social health, emotional health, spiritual health. Our sexual health is strongly tied. When things are off in that region, they talk about it. When people are having not where the expectation between where they think they should be and what's going on, there's a problem. Yeah. So STIs and sexual transmitted infections are things that people are not aware of, and really a lot of people need to talk about, even people who are older. Yeah.
So I know you're an HIV specialist in terms of, and for those listening, I hope you're realizing, right? So we've got Dr. Toyin. She's a physician, an internal medicine trained physician who gets on to do further training in infectious diseases. And then within the subspecialty of infectious diseases, she's now further subspecialized as an HIV specialist. Now, that said, you are ID. What would you say, given the pandemic, what are some of the priorities that our audience and those particularly in the perimenopausal, menopausal, postmenopausal age groups, what should be some of their priorities in this time of pandemic, COVID withstanding? What are the other things should they be prioritizing right now as we head into winter and so forth?
Oh my gosh. That's a whole, and I know you've been doing a lot of things around COVID, but if you think about it, some of the simplest things that we've been talking about for months and months and months is the need to wear your mask, a face covering, because that will protect you and that will protect others, right? Knowing that 40% of people who transmit this infection are asymptomatic. So, and I know you did a video, a couple of, like, it's, there's personal good of protecting yourself, but also the greater good of protecting others, because not just from spreading the virus, but the impact of delaying the time when we can actually get back to life as close to what it was before has implications on other things. I know that services, primary care services, preventive services, a lot of things got shut down while in the thick of this. So there's, wearing your mask, staying physically distant. And we kind of moved away from social distance to physical distance because we know the importance of mental health and connectiveness. And thankfully, we can connect through platforms like this. We can call people, we can FaceTime with family, but it's important to stay physically distant. And, hand washing, we can't overemphasize. And I hope that never goes back to where it was, where people didn't wash their hands. So hand washing, and staying home if you're ill. But more importantly, as we're going into the flu season, is to get your flu shot. I got mine about 4 weeks ago. My daughters got theirs, my husband, my siblings, everyone. So those of us, getting your flu shot, because up till this year, every year, it's only about 45 to maybe 50% of the US population that gets a flu shot every year. This year, we need to do it. And we know that if you get your flu shot, what you're don't want going into the fall and the winter when we're now indoors, we can't do the walks outside, the ventilation is poor, everybody has the heat on, everything's recirculating. Then, you're more likely, if somebody in that household is exposed to COVID, to spread that infection. You don't want to have a fever and cough and like, is this COVID? Is this flu? So it's really important to get your flu shot. It's a little earlier this year, but better to get your flu shot, continue to do the masking. There are already vaccine trials going on. There are things looking at, lots of trials on treatments. But again, we're in that world where prevention is always a lot better than cure, right? So obviously the tenets of COVID are around testing, the 3 T's: testing, tracing, and treatment, right? Treatment. So obviously when people are infected and they're ill, we want to make sure they have access to the best care, which is important to make sure we don't overwhelm our systems, right? And so the treatment aspect, there are things being looked at, antivirals, monoclonal antibodies, things that have been studied, right? But the vast majority of the population is making sure we do adequate testing. There are lots of new testing and expanded testing opportunities, and then being able to do effective tracing and people isolating and quarantining as appropriate. And those are the things we can do. In the meantime, also, working on your exercise as much as you can, your healthy diet, healthy eating, all of those things that kind of boost your immune system, not in place of a mask, in addition to, right? Things that you have control over. And as soon as things start to open up where you can get your preventive things done, like your mammograms, your colon cancer screening, you don't want to let those go by the wayside. So my thing would be getting your health in the best it can be, making sure you have refills on your medications. If you have chronic illnesses, a lot of offices are doing 3-month refills, 6-month refills. I'm doing that, getting your flu shot, continue to wear your mask. It's a very simple intervention that decreases remarkably your risk of acquiring that infection. But also, you could be healthy and have no symptoms and transmit that. So if everybody went around thinking, I could have this, and the next person could have this, we would all wear a mask. And that's what's important. While we wait for the exciting
news of the vaccine. Yes. No, and I think it's so important that people hear that, which is stop thinking that you're healthy so you can't spread something. That's exactly what makes you a spreader, is you feel healthy. So you need to wear your mask so that you're about. Yes. And I think so many people forget that. Well, Dr. Toyin, I enjoyed this conversation. I hope you did too.
I did.
Awesome.
We just met today.
We just met today.
I know. We've just been emailing and texting.
And, guys, again, scrolling at the bottom, you can see the website. Go to Dr. Cindy Duke. Look for Dr. Toyin's guest blog on menopause. Dr. Toyin, I'm looking forward to your other submissions. I'm excited. I think this conversation can go on and on. I love the parts that we talked about today, everything ranging from menopause to why we should talk about it, why we should talk to our family members about menopause, the safe sexual health in menopause and post-menopause, the reason for loving self and taking care of self during a divorce, post-divorce, and even into a second marriage. And I look forward to our ongoing conversation. For those who would like to follow you, where can they find you on social media?
Okay, I'm trying to expand that. My Instagram is at Dr. T Fal, and then my website is www.thedecadeafter.com, which is it's written about the book. And then also on my podcast is 10 Minutes with TM Fal, which is my middle initial, and it's really about a whole variety of topics, really. So, comparison, similarities, self-help, just things like that. And then, those are my platforms. And I really have enjoyed, this conversation. I admire the work that you do, the empowerment things you do with young women, the fact that you're still doing stuff back in your home country of Trinidad and Tobago. You're doing a lot of education and awareness, and it's really important. It's that kind of work and giving back and having that conversation about our sexual health and empowering other women. That's what life's about, right? Just doing all we can,
A big difference, and it's what we have to leave behind in the end, in terms of that legacy. My hope is that whatever we're doing today, you and I, it amplifies such that the next persons who take the baton from us will even further it. And so
Yes.
thank you so much for appearing today. I really enjoyed it. For those of you listening, feel free to contact Dr. Toyin on her various social media and on her website at thedecadeafter.com. And until then, see you guys next week. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.